Well, good morning and happy Sabbath. Glad to see each of you here this morning. How many of you have tried to learn something that was difficult to learn and caused you a lot of pain at first? Okay, yeah, I think all of us have been down that road, in particular as children. One of my memories growing up was learning to ride a bicycle. It was in Missouri, O'Fallon, Missouri, back in the, late 70s, early 80s. My mom brought me out to ride a bike at first. And as all parents do, they get behind the bike, they sit you on it, and they scoot you along until you get the feel of how the pedals go, because it just feels totally unnatural doing those pedals, you know. It feels really weird, and then you're trying to steer this thing at the same time. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and finally my mom gave me that scoot off that you do, and I was doing it. I remember I was on my, it was a banana seat bike, green and orange. It was an ugly bike, it really was, on this thing, and I remember being able to do this but having no concept of steering. So my mom pushed me, and at first I was going down the road, and then I went off the road and right into a ditch, and just tumbled end over end. I'm sure my mom felt pretty bad. She brought me right in and gave me lots of ice cream to compensate for the accident. It just reminds me a little bit of how difficult it must have been for these Corinthian folk to comprehend and to understand what they were getting into as they embraced the gospel, as they embraced the truth, and as Paul was trying to teach them what it was all about. And the Corinthian church, just so you understand, was not an easy church. It was a difficult church in terms of how they behaved, as far as their morals, as far as what they believed was right and wrong. So Paul here is trying to establish a foundation for them to understand what Christianity is all about and where it's all going. If we turn back just a little bit from our scripture reading to 1 Corinthians 12, he's kind of giving them a shove-off on their bike, if you will, to help them to understand the direction that they're going in. As we're looking through 1 Corinthians 12, you see that Paul is describing spiritual gifts. He's talking about unity and diversity in the body as we go through. And I want to focus in towards the end here in verses 27 through 31 before we get into 1 Corinthians 13. Because he's setting this foundation. You remember, this is the early church. And they're really trying to grasp how to do things. It's not like what we have now of years of tradition and all kinds of customs that have come into place that we're comfortable with as a church. This is far different. This is a time and a place that is tenacious, challenging, where individuals are trying to do things one way and somebody else is trying to do something another way. And Paul is trying to make sense of this for them all. Verse 28, we pick up, and God has appointed these in the church. First apostles, second prophets, third teachers, after that miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, varieties of tongues. So he's setting all this up for us to understand how everything works in the church. He goes on to say, are all apostles, are all prophets? Apparently there was an issue there that there's a lot of overlap, somebody wanted to be everything, and that's just not the way that it works. Do all have the gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? And then we have this text, which I think helps us to understand the context of what we have in chapter 13. But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. Now, it's easy for us to look on the church now as very institutionalized. Do you understand what institutionalized is? Very established, very rigid, very much with the rules and regulations. If this happens, then this happens. A equals B equals C, etc. We have this whole lineup of how things work. But as Paul is establishing these early churches, as he's traveling from place to place, as he's writing these letters, as he's preaching to congregations and helping them to understand and embrace the truth of the gospel, There is something beyond just all the rules and regulations, the do's and the don'ts, the A equals B equals C, that he's trying to get people to understand about the gospel and about the truth. And that's the context that we have here in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians. He goes on to say, "Though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels, and have not love, I become a sounding brass or a clanging cymbal." So the first three verses here in 1 Corinthians 13 point out what is lacking when we don't have love. "And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." So Paul is helping us to understand there is an undergirding foundation. There is something there for each of us to understand beyond just what we see and we know, as far as the institution of the church, as far as the leadership of the church, as far as the pastors and the elders and the deacons, beyond all the structure. There has to be an undergirding foundation that rules the church. And it's important for us to understand what he's talking about, because the translation here is difficult for us to equate with what Paul is trying to help us to understand. That word love is so used in such a loose fashion today. That word love is something that is very nebulous, is very unclear to us. We apply love in so many different contexts, in so many different ways. I think it's helpful if we understand the kind of word that Paul was using here when we talk about love. Now, we've understood it to be the word agape, and that's true. But in the Greek language, there were many words that described love. We had words like sterge. We had words like phileo. Those words are more of a family kind of relationship or a brotherly kind of love between one another. Then there are words like eros, which we get the word erotic. Those words are used in more of a passionate sense. But this word agape really, for a long time, sat on the shelf in Greek history. It's one word that was not used so much because it wasn't really understood. But it's a word that was adopted by Christianity to apply to the love that God has for us. And this is what Paul is using here. This is the context that Paul is using it. Now, how many of you may have the King James Version out there? King James? Okay. I believe in the King James you see the word charity. Is that right? The word charity. Just so you understand, just in terms of history, that word charity was implanted by a theologian of Catholic persuasion by the name of Thomas Aquinas. That word charity comes from Latin, which is just a benevolent kind of love, which is used in place of what the original Greek intended, which is the word agape. Agape really is a unique word which needs to be understood if we're going to get to the bottom of what the gospel is all about and if we're going to be able to function as a church correctly. So, as we look forward here, verse 4, he starts to describe what this agape love is. And you know what we like to do? We like to immediately equate this to our own lives. We like to immediately try to measure ourselves up to what's being described here in verses 4 through 8. But it's important, first of all, to see God in this context. Because above all else here, what we see is a portrait of what true love is. And there's no better portrait of what true love is than God himself. So keep that in mind as we look through verses 4 through 8 this morning. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And verse 8 sums up this thought of love. Love never fails. There is no better picture of God but what we have here in this text, which describes love. And I'd like to point that out a little bit more for you. If you turn forward with me to 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4, we get into a little bit more of a description of the love of God and what that's all about. So if you turn there with me. 1 John 4, and I'm looking at verses 7 through 11 is where I'm at in 1 John chapter 4. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. You know, it's so unfortunate that love is used so loosely in our society and our culture today. Just from the generation I grew up in, love was always something I associated with hippies. I don't know how else to put it. I always thought of the hippie guys with the long hair and smoking the weed and their flowers and whatnot, and it just seemed weak to me. Love didn't seem like it was an adequate thing. Of course, love in our world today is equated to something that's used to get what you want, basically. You know, we use that word so loosely. But when we come to the Bible, when we come to an understanding of who God is and what He's about, we have a clearer picture of what's intended to us from the Lord. Verse 8, he who does not love does not know God. And the text here, this word, once again, that's used to describe God is agape. For God is agape. In other words, that description of God that John gives to us is so profound, so beyond what our perception of what a being should be. It goes beyond what we can really grasp onto and understand, because we are so self-centered, so selfish, and have such a twisted view of what God is, of what love is, that God becomes this distorted picture. God is agape. What that means to us is that everything that God does has to be in the context of agape. It has to be in the context of love. Every doctrine, every action, every word pronounced by the Lord has to be in this context. He goes on to say, in this, the love of God was manifested towards us. And this scoops us back around to 1 Corinthians 13. In this, the love of God was manifested towards us, that God has sent His only begotten Son into the world, that we might live through Him. It's important for us to note that the best, the brightest revelation of who God is in the reflection of Jesus Christ. That's how we understand what and who God's love is. So if you turn back with me to 1 Corinthians 13, and let's look at this in the context of Jesus. In your mind's eye, picture the ministry of Christ and what He reveals to us about God. Love, or I can replace love there with Jesus. Jesus suffers long and is kind. Jesus does not envy. Jesus does not parade Himself and is not puffed up. That, in particular, reminds me of the Dark Ages where there were a lot of people that were opposed to the oppression that was brought forth by the Catholic Church. And there were only so many ways that you could protest against the ruling religion of that time. But there was one way that creative people, that artists did this. They would take portraits, sketched out with chalk and with whatever materials they had, of the Pope on his white stallion with all his regal robes and beautiful, beautiful headset, and of course flowers and everything else on around him in a very rich setting. And right next to that picture of the Pope, they put a picture of Christ entering into Jerusalem on a lowly donkey with His clothes tattered, and certainly what a contrast that was that we have in Christ. One who is not paraded himself nor puffed up. Now, if there was anybody that had reason to brag, that had reason to really puff himself up and to show, the kind of power and authority that he had, it would have been Jesus, but that was not in the context of agape. Does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, and thinks no evil. Now, if you or I were put in the context of what Christ had to endure from those who opposed him, from the name-calling, from the accusations, from all the little trials and tribulations that he faced, I think in a single day, you and I would snap. We would just tell people off left and right? I think I would, with some of these guys, knowing what they were doing, knowing what they were trying to plot against me, I think I would have snapped. But that was not our Jesus. Jesus did not snap. He did not behave rudely, although rightly we could have seen why he slapped that guy upside the head, right? But that was not our Christ. He never did that. Does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth. Bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. I know we like to throw pity parties for ourselves sometimes with our lives. I know that we face challenges sometimes that seem insurmountable, that seem so challenging that we just fall on our knees and go, I can't do it. I just can't do this anymore. I know we face those kind of days, but never will our lives ever equal up to the stress and the pressure that Christ felt. Never can we equate our lives and the things that we endure to what he had to endure. Just imagine all the forces of hell bent against you on a daily basis, and that being manifest through people who are just crude and not understanding and being used against the ministry that you're trying to establish. This is what Christ faced on a daily basis. It's so important for us to realize that this was no vacation spot for Jesus. This was very difficult for him to do and to face. But I love what verse 8 sums up for us here. Love never fails. Isn't that beautiful? If we once again replace that agape word there in verse 8, Christ never fails. And it's true. Christ did not fail. If anybody had reason to despair and to give up, it would have been Jesus on that cross. When all heaven seemed billions of miles away and all hell seemed to be pressing down upon him, so that to the point where we're told he couldn't even see beyond the gates of the tomb. He thought that he was going to die forever, and that was it. Yet he was willing to stay there for us. But Christ never fails. Our love, coming around to thinking about ourselves again, our love is so passive sometimes, so futile, so minuscule compared to what we have here in the Bible. Did I ever tell you about the time that my first Valentine with Monica? Did I ever tell you that? Oh, it's a great story. I think it was 1993, our first Valentine, February, and we had just started dating, been about a couple months in, something like that. And I innocently asked, "What do you want for Valentine's Day?" And of course, Monica was unassuming. She said, "Oh, don't get me anything. Don't worry about it. Don't get me anything." Now, me being a dumb guy, what did I do? I didn't do anything. So it's hard for me to live that down now, because I realize, that love was expected, and rightfully so, on a holiday like that. But for you young fellows out there who one day are looking for a wife, when that girl says, "Oh, don't do that for me, don't worry about it," it's a trap, okay? Just so you understand and get it. Love is a complicated thing, but Paul does break it down for us and helps us to understand that love has to go beyond our selfish nature. It has to go beyond what we think we need. What Jesus helps us to understand is that love is supposed to benefit those around us, not just ourselves. This agape love, which is described is this selfless love, is this way of looking and understanding the world, which is so important for us as a church to embrace and to shine with. Now, it's very possible for the church to go on as an institution. It's very possible for any church to keep going on and to just follow the rules and keep hiring and firing and retiring whoever comes along, and to keep playing and doing the role. But according to Paul here in 1 Corinthians, when there's no love, there's no point. And it's important for us to embrace that in our own lives as we consider our walk in our sphere of influence with our family, with our friends, within our church. Where's the love is the question. Where is it in our lives? Where do we fall short? How can we more reflect what Christ gives to us here? This high, high mark and measure of what love is. Where have we fallen short? Where do we need this more in our lives? It's something for us to pray about and consider. And this morning, I want to ask that you would take time to think about it this Sabbath. Where have you fallen short? Where's your love in your life? And perhaps, how have you not done what God has called you to do as a witness for Him? With that, let's go ahead and turn to our final hymn, which is number 99.